Hello, everyone. My name is Sagita Miriam Sunara. I'm a professor at the Conservation Restoration Department of the Arts Academy in Split, and I'm also a member of the Croatian Conservation Restoration Association. And I would like to remind everyone right away that this event is being recorded, and by participating in the event, you conform with its recording, and of the recording will later be posted to the YouTube channel of the Croatian Conservation Restoration Association. Now, our speaker this evening is Eléonore Kissel, and the lecture that we will hear is a part of a series of online lectures by invited heritage professionals organized by the Croatian Conservation Restoration Associations. And these lectures are intended for professional conservator restorers, for conservation restoration students, for heritage professionals of all profiles and all other interested individuals. Now, Eléonore's lecture is titled Establishing Priorities for Collections Rescue Operations in Case of Crisis, General Principles and Focus on Non-European Ethnographic Collections from the Musée de Branly, Jacques Chirac, Paris. I hope, Eléonore, that I have pronounced the name of your institution correctly. Now, the topic of cultural heritage in crisis and post-crisis situations is something that we in Croatia are currently very concerned about at the moment. As most of you hopefully know, because we have an international audience this evening, Croatia was hit by two devastating earthquakes last year. The first one struck our capital, Zagreb, in March 2020. And then in late December, the towns of Petrinja and Sisak were hit by an even stronger earthquake. And I should mention that even today, the ground near Petrinja shook as a 3.9 magnitude earthquake struck the same area. Now, what we want to do in the Croatian Conservation Restoration Association is to provide a platform for the exchange of knowledge and practical experiences related to heritage salvage. And we also want to contribute to the building of professional competencies of the people who care for cultural heritage. And before I give the microphone over to Eléonore, I would just like to say a few words about her, to introduce her to you. So she is a conservator restorer who initially specialized in art and documents on paper. And she then became a consultant in preservation of cultural property. She has carried out numerous preliminary studies, collections, condition surveys, storage areas reorganization programs, and museum, libraries, and archives relocation between 1994 and 2014. And then since 2014, she has been in charge of the Conservation Restoration Unit at the Musée de Branly, Jacques Chirac in Paris. And she has intervened several times in flood-stricken cultural heritage institutions. And she has been teaching the rescue of cultural property since 2001. And I had the pleasure of personally meeting her in 2019 at the ECO General Assembly, which took place in Zagreb, because Eléonore is the delegate of the French Association of Professional Conservators Restorers in ECO. So ECO brought us together, and I would like to thank Eléonore for accepting the invitation to give this lecture as a part of this event. Now, before you take the floor, Eléonore, I would like to ask our meeting attendees to keep their microphones muted during the lecture. And if you have any questions, then I kindly ask you to use the chat box to write them there. And you can write your questions also in Croatian, and I will translate them at the end of the lecture to Eléonore. So one option is writing the lectures in the chat section, but if you prefer to ask your questions in person, you can do that as well. When Eléonore finishes with her talk, then you can turn your microphone on, turn your camera on, and ask the question in person. So just to remind the Croatian attendees, you can pose questions in Croatian, and I will translate them. And now let me do just one technical intervention of making Eléonore temporary host of the meeting. Eléonore, now you can start sharing your screen, and I will just briefly confirm that we can see you and that we can hear you. So let's see if everything works. Excellent.
Can everybody hear me?
We can hear you and we can see everything, and you can start.
Thanks. All right. So thank you very much for having me at this conference series, which is so wisely initiated by the Croatian Conservation Restoration Association, HRD. I'm sorry. It's true. I met Sagita through ECHO, and it's a very pan-European audience, I can see. I also saw on the chat box that there is a colleague from Quebec. So you see, it is a truly international audience. I'm very impressed, and I will do my best to convey the meaning that I want to convey to you today. On this question of establishing priorities for collections rescue operations in cases of crisis, with a specific focus on the non-European ethnographic collections of the Musée du quai Branly Jacques Chirac in Paris, where I am head of preservation. So identifying priority works and practicing their rescue is not a new idea. You have this wonderful picture of a firefighting exercise at the Krakow National Museum circa 1910. Not so long ago, an international standard on which I had the pleasure and the privilege to work along with many colleagues, an international standards on emergency preparedness and rescue came out. And of course, it focuses partly on priorities. And the question is always, how do you establish priorities for salvage operations? There are a number of criteria that can be used. One of them, usually the first one that we think about, is the Mona Lisa syndrome. It's the rarity, or for books or archives, the number of known copies. And along the same lines, one could think of types for natural history specimens. A type is the specimen that was used to describe a particular species. So, of course, these are very rare, since by definition they are unique. You can also think of the representativeness of the artwork for the cultural heritage institution. Every museum has its Gioconda, its Mona Lisa. You go to a specific museum to see a specific artwork, and if it disappears, it's an asset that disappears, a touristic and an economic asset, let alone a cultural heritage asset that disappears. But you can also think of risk of loss of meaning, of documentary or cultural value, and that's something we will talk about a little bit later in the lecture. And then there's this block which I made, which is the one that I'm most familiar with as a conservator restorer, which is the material fragility, the intrinsic fragility of any given work, artwork, or document. And one thing we will think about together is how the sensitivity to water is not necessarily the same as the sensitivity to soot and to temperature elevation, which you would see in the case of a fire. And that's something we, as conservators at least, need to think about very thoroughly. Then, again, from a material standpoint, there's a question of format and of weight. Again, the Mona Lisa is not so difficult to evacuate. Of course, you have to unscrew a lot of screws because it's a high safety artwork. But it's not a 2,000 kilograms sculpture or 40 square meters paintings. So when you think about prioritizing objects for rescue, you need to think if they can actually be moved or if they cannot be moved. And you need to think about the possibility of moving sometimes collections which are so important in quantity. We will go back to that as we go along. Then for archives and libraries to some extent, there's the frequency of consultation. some archives are much more consulted by the public, by genealogists, by historians, by the public than others. And so when considering the criteria for establishing priorities, that might be in one of them. And the other thing is the quantity of information regarding the dimension. And that's the case for all microforms mostly. And I guess you could have sort of the same approach to documents that have been numerized, that have been transformed into a digital format. The question is, do you need the documentation, the information, or do you need the actual document for rescue? Then there's the legal status. For instance, in museums, in many museums, we have loans. We also happen to have deposits, and what one might think that if somebody deposits a precious artwork into your museum, it might be for that only for that sake a priority for rescue because it is not your own. In terms of archives, the legal retention period might be considered. Are you going to deploy massive rescue energy into archives that are going to be destroyed in 5 years from now? It's a question that may be asked. There's, of course, the financial value, which is always something that is very difficult to appreciate with artworks. And you see, there are already a lot of criteria on the screen, but there are others. You might want to consider authenticity, you might want to consider integrity, you might want to consider the heritage specificity of specific object types. And I'm thinking, for instance, of human remains. The possibility of replacement, for instance, in the library, can you actually buy books for face value? The state of conservation. So you have many criteria and you need to think about them. What may help you in defining priorities is considering that partial evacuation is more likely than total evacuation. And at the Champs-sur-Marne Castle, for instance, they decided to establish 3 categories of artworks: priority 1, priority 2, and unmovable objects such as chimney fronts and the likes. In the archives of the Département des Alpes-Maritimes, there are in total 7 linear kilometers of archives, but the category 1, the first things that you want to evacuate is only, it's actually quite a lot, but considering the general holdings, it's 500 linear meters, so half a linear kilometer. These numbers were published. They're a bit old, but I chose to show them to you because it gives you a sense of proportion. At the Musée du quai Branly Jacques Chirac, we have approximately you can see the numbers, 337,500 objects and nearly 500,000 inventoried photographs. And almost the totality of the collection has been prioritized by curators into priorities 1, 2, and 3. And you can see that priority 1 is small, considering you still need to evacuate potentially nearly 13,000 objects. But of course, these 13,000 objects are scattered in various storage rooms and in various display rooms. And so one hopes that one won't have to evacuate the whole lot at the same time. And it's the same thing for the museum's library holdings. There's over 8 linear kilometers of library holdings. And again, only about 500 of them are 500 linear meters, roughly 6%, are priorities. And this question of prioritization, it works really well, especially if you're minded for evacuation and if your collections are actually ready to be moved. So what you're seeing on the screen is a trolley that was devised by and for the Musée du quai Branly. in which priority one collections that are in storage, unless they are too big, they are oversized and they won't fit in the trolley, unless that is the case, they are put into these trolleys, and these trolleys are regularly, at least once a year, used in an exercise so that people are used to handling them and making them travel through the corridors and bringing them into the freight elevators so that we can bring them out of storage and into the upper levels of the museum. And the same is done, exercises are done yearly for precious books, and these are the books being transported through, you can see that the travel that needs to be done with the trolley is already materialized on a scheme, on a graph, and the books are brought up to the library, to the research room, so that they can be evacuated. And the same with archives, with a different fashion. There the archives are palletized, but the priority archives, the priority one books and the priority one objects are all identified. Now, the choice of the collections which you are actually going to be you are actually going to be able to save. And now we're changing the paradigm, and we're going to the other end of the spectrum when we're not talking about evacuation anymore. We are talking about what are you going to be able to save once the disaster has happened. So the choice of the collections to be saved is not relevant to a certain extent when the level of destruction is massive. And this is the example of a fire, Musée de la Vie d'Antan in Mont-le-Bon. It burned down on March 17, 2015. And the previous slide was the night of the fire. And this is me looking at the extent of damage the day after the fire. Now, when you have that, when the whole building has collapsed and when everything in it has burned down, considering which objects you're going to save is a bit preposterous. And I'm giving you another example, which is the one of the Hurricane Katrina, which happened on August 29th in 2005. Fortunately, I wasn't there. This is a beautiful picture of Katrina, but it was a very, very dangerous event. And this is the Gulfport, Harrison County Library, an external view of the library and an internal view of the library. You have no books left. They have all flown out the windows, quite literally. So the question of what you're going to be able to save in such situations is very difficult. And this is what in English is called force majeure in English. And basically it relates to any disaster which is beyond reasonable control. And it's something that's mentioned by Judith Forston in her rather extraordinary and very helpful book about, it's a how to do it book on emergency planning that was designed specifically for libraries and archives. And it's a very good read. And it's a way to take a bit of distance. To some extent, there are things that you won't be able to do, plan, or save. Now, sometimes you have planned and you have saved, but the level of destruction is still very significant. And you may hit the limits of your prioritization when it becomes difficult to access the objects that underwent the disaster. And this is the case in the Departmental Archives of Charente-Maritime after the storm Xintia, which happened on February 28th, 2010. This is a view from, you can see that the archival building is right next to the sea. And this is an internal view. It was basically a tsunami. This is a view of the archives before the flood, the tsunami. And this is a view of the same archives after the flood. And so you have all these documents floating around. You have a very, very high level of water, and you have a difficulty to access them. Say you have decided as an archivist that your priority items are here, or they are here. How are you actually going to access them? And indeed, in this particular case, the compact storage had to be dismantled with jigsaws because the salt in the seawater had gotten everything rusty in a couple of hours. And immediately after the archivists were able to actually enter the building, which is a couple of days only after the tsunami, the storm and the tsunami that it provoked, well, they couldn't move. They couldn't move the compact storage. All of this was completely locked by the salt water. So this is one of these instances where your pre-planning won't work, and you have to be conscious about it. And here's another type of example, another example of difficulty of establishing priorities. This is the Musée Giraudet in Montargis, which got flooded by massive floods from the Seine on May 31st, 2016. And this is a view of the storage room. Basically, the water went into the storage room with such strength. It was such a fierce phenomenon that the objects moved, that the furniture collapsed, that everything went head over toes. And how are you actually going to find your priority objects in there? And actually, the museum had identified priority objects, very important objects, which it had put on its website. And that was a fantastic thing to do, because what it enabled us to do was to put up pictures of what we were looking for. And then whenever we could, remove this, remove this, remove this, remove this, remove this, finally have access to this, or finally have access to this, or finally have access to something that was over there. Well, while we were taking it out of the storage room, we would look at the pictures that had been put on the wall and see if what we had in our hands was a priority object. And this is how we found, actually I found it, but by pure chance, it could have been any one of my colleagues, Giraudet's palette. The painter, it's a monographic museum on a specific painter, Giraudet, and this was his palette. So it was a priority one object. And we found it because we were able to identify that it was something we were looking for. So prioritizing is really important, no matter what the circumstances, unless you're beyond a reasonable control. And what you're going to do when you prioritize your objects or documents is, at least in storage, you're going to try to put them together so that they're easier to find when you actually need to evacuate. And here is an example in an archival service with oversized works on paper. This is another example for paintings in a fine arts museums. This is an example of medieval and Renaissance ivories that were put together in boxes and in cabinets so that they can be accessed readily. And this is the prioritization from the Louvre, with the archaeological objects put in standard format crates, ready to be evacuated. And here are the archaeological small pieces and shards that are on mobile cabinets that have been put on wheels so that they can be readily evacuated in case of a flood, because most of the Louvre Museum, just like at most of the Musée du Quai Branly Museum, are floodable. So when you're in a storage area, it's pretty easy to regroup things and label them so that you know this is where my priority one something, objects, documents stand. When you're in a display room, it's more difficult, but there are a couple of solutions. Here's one. It's the Retable d'Isenheim, very famous retable painting and sculptures in Colmar. And what you see on the left is a label which is stuck to the wall. And here is a label that is put underneath the painting. And when you have a disaster, many times you have no electricity or low visibility. And when the first responders will come in, for instance, the firefighters, they will have flashlights. And what they will do is they will flash their light at the bottom of the walls until the label becomes reflective. When it is hit by the light, it becomes reflective. And so these label will help guide the firefighters all the way to the room in which the priority one objects stand. And I chose this painting, but all the priority one objects in that particular museum have these labels, which are very discreet in normal daylight, but which really stand out. If you imagine yourself being in a room full of soot and full of smoke, you will see this reflective label, and it will guide you to the work that you actually need to evacuate. And that's possible, but it's not always possible. For instance, here we are in a beautiful historic house, which is the historic house of Georges Clemenceau, one of France's president, in Saint-Vincent-sur-Jard in Vendée. This is the view he had from his window, so I would very gladly work there. And this is the view he had when he just turned to his right, and this is his library. And let's say that you as a curator decide that these books are the priority one books to evacuate in the event of a disaster. Well, you are in a historic house environment, and it's going to be very difficult to put any sort of label, self-reflective or not, because it's going to be hideous, and you are in an environment in which things need to look good, because you are here for delectation. You are not here to see labels everywhere to tell the public what the priority objects are. So I'm just saying that prioritization works. It's absolutely fundamental. You have to think of the criteria, but you have limitations to the concept. And these are practical limitations, both in terms of rescue and in terms of evacuation. To get back to prioritization criteria, many things may come to your mind. One of them is the risk of loss of scientific value. And that is something that you will need to address for all the objects and documents which come in bulk, for lack of a better word, of a more elegant concept. For instance, these are, this is money. And you can see that if these labels get lost, or if the storage becomes even more chaotic than it is there, you're going to risk losing definitely the scientific value of these particular objects. And it's the same for herbarium parts or leaves. If this order becomes disrupted, or if the specimens become detached from the leaves, it is a catastrophe. Even if you can save the specimen on one side and the paper on the other side. This is archives. They are bags containing papers, documents that relate to a specific trial. So if the bag becomes disconnected from the archives, as may very well happen in the case of a flood such as the one I showed you for the Musée Giraudet or for the departmental archives of Charente-Maritime, it would be a catastrophe. And so maybe you will want to prioritize these types of objects or documents, because you know that if things become disconnected, it will lose its scientific value. And it's the same here with an object from the Musée du quai Branly. It is a divination bag. It is made to foresee the future with magic methods. And the contents of these bags are laid out here on the side. It's Photoshop. The actual object looks like that. But if you take the little shells and the beads and the little rocks, and there's a crab leg in there somewhere, and there is here a pipe and all these little objects. If you lose them, if they get separated from the bag that encloses them, and it encloses them with a simple knot, again, it's a scientific catastrophe, and the object will lose all its meaning. Now, when prioritization is based not on what we just mentioned, which is meaning, but more specifically on material issues. What you need to consider is the difference in impact for a specific type of material of various disasters or various disaster causes. For instance, on this particular slide, we have parchment. It's only parchment. And what you see here at the top left, this one, and on the center, is parchment that shrank because temperature got higher. And above a specific temperature, parchment, especially when it's hydrolyzed, especially when it's degraded already, it will shrink. And this I know I've handled this particular piece of archives, which was underwent a fire in 1870 in the city of Marseille. And it has several specificities when you handle it. One of them is that it is absolutely tightly locked, and it's not a material. It will spring back if you try to open the roll. And the other specificity is that it really, really smells of smoke. And we are talking 150 years after the fire. So this is what elevating the temperature will do to parchment. And on this picture and on this picture, it is what water will do. So it will give a deformation of the material, which is different from what will happen with a fire. And it will give stains, which is common with the damages that are caused by water. Here, a painting with the same idea. This is the damage that was done in a historic house after a fire. And it is very typical damage of the picture with these little bubbles that happen in the varnish layer. This is a painting that was flooded and covered in mud after Katrina. So it's another type of damage. This is a painting that was that underwent a flood, but not a massive flood, just water dripping from the ceiling. And the water actually did this, went from the top to the bottom of the ceiling and from the back. And when you look at the picture, well, you can see this shape of a T here, this T shape, which you have here. And this is the damage on the front that was caused by water just seeping in the back, dripping in the back. And this is another type of damage, still done by water, but after 72 hours of immersion, of a painting by Zurbaran from the Musée Giraudet, which we looked for 3 days after the flood, after we were able to enter. We were looking for the Zurbaran, and it's not, you can see from the scale, it's not a small painting. And the storage room in the Musée Giraudet was perfectly well sorted out. It is because objects move in a disaster, and what you see, these white this white appearance, it's the water that seeped underneath the paint layer, and that gives these chancy, these blooms that are typical of post-flood impact on painting. Again, now for inorganic material, because inorganic materials have a good press in terms of disaster. We always have this sort of idea, which is really untrue, that inorganic material will handle a disaster better. Well, it depends on the type of disaster. And what you see here is what can happen on glazed ceramic. After a fire, the soot will seep underneath the glazing, and it can never, ever, ever be removed, be retrieved. So it is a very deep and grave loss of meaning and of materiality for these types of objects. And it is true that with water, ceramics can handle it better, to the point that in this particular disaster, my colleague needed to put her hand and make the water move so that it could actually be seen that these objects had been in a flood. Now, if we consider one specific material and one specific disaster cause, here we're going to look at paper and water. Well, again, you can't make too many wide assumptions, because the way in which a handmade paper, which is here on the picture on the left, is going to react to water, to a flood, is very different than the way in which mechanical made and wood pulp paper is going to react in a flood. And it's again very different than the way in which papier glacé, a coated paper, will react in a flood. And so you might want to think about that when you're establishing priorities. For instance, I can tell you right off that this is going to be more difficult to rescue, because if it dries too fast, it's going to stick, the pages are going to stick to themselves. But maybe we can decide that it's okay, because this is a fairly recent book and we could buy a new one. Okay, so if you have to choose between these two, well, handmade paper will react infinitely better to a flood than wood pulp paper. And so one might want to consider that maybe in this case, age is not the criteria to be looking for, but intrinsic fragility of a specific type of paper when it is confronted to water. Again, paper, and again, water. These are posters that were put on the walls of the cities during the war. And so it's a very bad quality paper. It is also tinted paper, it's pink, and it is a very, very, very thin paper. It's like cigarette thin. And this, if it's underwater for several days, it might be a downright disaster. Now, what can we think now about these 17th century archives, which are huge? So form, format, the thickness of the paper, all of this is going to play a role in the reaction of any given material to any given degradation factor. And what I told you about paper is also true for inorganic material. And again, we might want to consider ceramics as being a big family. But in this case of a pre-Columbian archaeological artifact from Mexico, well, it's unglazed earthenware. Whereas here it is glazed, and here it is even more glazed. It is glass-like glazed because it is a faience. So if you put water next, or if you put these objects in contact with water, or if you put these objects in an environment where there's been a fire, the reaction of these three types of objects is going to be very, very different. In terms of prioritization, one of the questions one might want to ask, is what do we not know how to save? For instance, in the case of a temperature rise, in a fire, well, we're going to have a hard time saving wax. And for instance, this mask, this sculpture in wax, it's going to disappear. It's going to melt once you hit a fire temperature. So we might think, oh, well, that's of course because organic materials are so much more susceptible to risk of loss by fire than inorganic materials. Well, you may want to think again. This is the St. Nicolaus Church in Aachen, in Germany. And on December 31st, the night between December 31st and January 1st, people who were partying in the street threw firecrackers. And some firecrackers went through the glass, and all the stained glass was lost, all of it, because the temperature rose inside of the church where the fire developed. And the altar was also touched by the fire, clearly. And you can see how in the higher levels, because temperature is higher as it rises, the extent of damage is is larger, is more important. You can see also how soot will deposit itself according to the way in which it is pushed by the wind, but there are some areas in this sculpture which are virtually untouched by soot and others which are covered in it. So again, it's not a monolithic affair. It's not a fire will have such and such effect. It's a specific fire in a specific place. What effects could it have? And how do you deduce or choose your priorities starting from there? And again, the inorganic materials, which were the stained glass, they're gone. They exploded to pieces. Now, the presence of water, and this is something one needs to think about very thoroughly. The presence of water rarely implies the total destruction of cultural property. As a general rule, fires are much, much more damaging than water. And then, of course, you have exceptions. But what you might want to consider for prioritization, if you are at the risk of flood or of water damage, is the few materials that instantly do not react well to water, such as autochrome plates. This is an autochrome plate, so it's a direct color photography. And the color, the dyes, which are orange and green and purple, they are embedded in potato starch. Well, we all have made a stew someday and put potato starch in a glass of cold water, and it instantly dissolves. So if water hits an autochrome plate, you will lose the image instantly and forever because you have no negative, which is the reason why the Musée Albert Kahn in France, which has a very large collection of 72,000 autochrome plates, went a couple of years ago, it was at the end of the 90s, from a traditional way of storing the autochrome plates to a more modern way. And these particular boxes, which are boxes that I designed basically, were based on ammunition boxes. When you're a soldier and you have ammunition and you need to go through mud and to go through a river, you want to go on the other side of the river and know that your ammunition can still fire. Otherwise, you are at great risk. So these boxes were designed to be absolutely impervious to water, because we know that for autochrome plates, it is a very great danger. Another type of material that doesn't handle well the contact with water and it's instant is vegetable tanned leather, which will in a couple of seconds become brown. It will darken, but mostly it will become extremely brittle. So you want to avoid water on vegetable tanned leather books. What you might want to be careful about also is dyes in textiles, because dyes in textiles, it might not be instantaneous, such as with an autochrome plate, but within a couple of minutes, sometimes within a couple of hours, they will diffuse, and it's sometimes very iffy in terms of conservation treatment to get back to an original state in which your eyes will actually see the design as it was intended to be seen. And then another point of view, which you might want to take into account, is what do we don't know how to restore or conserve very well? For a paper conservator like myself, it might be pastel. Pastel and water don't mix very well. And this is a pastel that was flooded. And one can see that immediately when you're going to unframe it, you have a lot of the pastel, which is sitting on the glass, and it's never going to be possible to put it back on the stretcher and on the paper. So it's difficult. So you may want to prioritize that, because you know it's not so much that it's going to be very quick, the degradation with water, but because it's going to be very difficult to treat the object after that. And it's the same thing for various categories of objects. And I'm showing to you furniture with appliques and with decorative motifs, and which got almost, a lot of them got lost or lost at least in the beginning before we were able to retrieve them. So anything with inlays, marqueterie, again, it's difficult when the little bits of pieces of ivory or coral or turtle shell has been lost to put it back in. So it's something you might want to think about. And all things that come into boxes, and boxes that are part of the object, so such as this reliquary with all these little rolled paper, colored rolled paper and gilded rolled paper, and these little bones of saints and the little banners that tell you where who the saints are. This, if flooded, you will have a very hard time to remove the water vapor from the inside of the box, lest you want to completely unframe it. But these objects were conceived as closed boxes. So sometimes you're hesitant to actually open them. And what happens is that when you cannot get the water vapor out of them, well, you get what you see on the right, which is mold growth. And mold growth will happen in just a couple of days. Now, to be true, what I said earlier about water is that usually you don't have total destruction. And many of the responses to the questions asked previously about how materials react to water depend on the duration of the immersion. And that will impact many things. For instance, this is a pastel that was in a box that withstood 72 hours of immersion. And so your box can actually act as a very, very strong protector. And you might want to think about that when you're prioritizing objects for rescue. You also have all the category of objects which are going to take in water slowly. For instance, all gelatin-based photographs, when they are in contact with water, the gelatin layer will swell, but it won't happen instantly. It will happen. So in this instance, it happened on a collection of glass plate photographs, and the gelatin swelled, but the rescue operation was not fast enough to actually access the entirety of the collections, so that when it started drying, the gelatin, which had swelled, stuck to the paper, the craft paper envelopes that they were in. And what you're seeing here is the paper that remains on the gelatin. And this is hours and hours and hours of removal of every single fiber on an already fragilized gelatin plate. And you have to multiply that by, I don't know, 10,000 plates. So you can imagine the magnitude of the disaster. And then there are some objects such as this 18th century silk dress. The silk has become extremely fragile. It has been fragilized by oxygen. It has been fragilized by pollutants. It has been fragilized by light. And it is just mechanically very unstable. If you put if this dress withstands a flood or a contact with water during, I don't know, a couple of hours, it might not be that bad. But if it stays in contact with water for 24, 48, 72 hours, 4, 5, 6 days, then it will dislocate, literally. And so mechanically, it will have to be taken care of. And immersion time is particularly critical for inorganic material. This is a frame of a museum by Géricault, the three skulls. And what you see here is what is called, in French, pâte anglaise, English paste, I don't know if it translates that way, which is an amalgam with which one would do frames in the 19th century, particularly pre-industrial frames. And this thing will melt, literally, and it will fall off every painting that's within that particular frame. But it won't happen instantly. It will happen after a couple of hours, as will plaster. This is a plaster medallion that has been flooded for several days. And you can see here the part where it was out of the water for some reason. And here you can see how all the relief was eaten by the water, because after a while the plaster became soluble. And here is alabaster. It is a lovely piece in painted alabaster. You can see that here there were traces of painting, and this is before the flood. This picture and this picture, and you can see how the reliefs completely got eaten by the water. The alabaster started dissolving, and it doesn't happen in an hour. It happens in several days, but you have some floods that last several days. And lastly, in the presence of water, the fragility of collections also depend on the drying time after rescue. For instance, what I'm showing you is a book that was bound in alum todd, which is non-tanned leather. And so this particular material, if it's in contact with water long enough, it will become moldy. Again, it will start to putrefy as would flesh, basically, and not as tanned leather would do. These are toras drying in the Great Synagogue of Rome after the flood of the Arno in 1966. If you're going to go down that road of air drying a massive amount of paper or parchment documents, you want to make damn sure that you have enough manpower to check upon them day and night if necessary, to make sure that at the first moment you start seeing mold, you can act. Because if you don't act quick enough, you're going to have massive mold development. And again, I'm not pointing fingers in the sense that I know, because I've been through these situations, that sometimes you need 2, 4, 5, 6 days to have access to the material. So if it gets moldy because you can't access it, it's one thing. But once you've accessed it, you need to dry it before it gets moldy. And lastly, prioritization can be made on artworks that we don't know how to save in the event of a disaster. And I'm talking about objects on which we have had no practice in rescue exercises. Because the truth is, you don't put medieval alabasters and you don't put Egyptian sarcophagus like this one, like these ones, or mummies. You don't put them in water for the sake of putting them in water to make exercise. Whereas I do that with other things. I buy artworks at flea markets and I dump them into the water and I dump them into a chimney to see how they react and to see how we can actually save them. And sometimes you have good surprises, such as with daguerreotypes, for instance. But these mummies, Egyptian artifacts, we don't know. And so this is me calling a colleague who specialized in Egyptian artworks to ask her, what the heck are we going to do? What are our options? And this is a couple of conservators. All of these people are conservators the next day, and they're trying to figure it out because really, we don't have any answers. And if we had to prioritize collections today, these will certainly be a priority because we don't know how they will react in the case of a disaster, and we want to check up on them. Now at the Musée du Quai Branly, it's a very, very difficult situation because we have all these non-European objects that are made of a variety of non-standard materials. Vegetable fibers and feathers and dyes, in this case, which is a asmat mask from Oceania, reed and feathers and softwood and bamboo and fern and bark and paper and pigments on this headdress from the Vanuatu, again in Oceania. A mask made with bark cloth on a bamboo frame and dyes. I don't know how this will react in the case of a flood. A mask from the Ivory Coast, which is made with vegetable fibers and skin and hair, iron, resin, earth, blood, horns, seashell, walnuts. And probably we haven't found all the materials in this particular mask. Another mask from New Ireland, from Papua New Guinea. And this is wood, painted wood, so we can deal with painted wood. We know how it reacts. But this is moss and algae. And yes, algae comes from the sea, but how is it going to react once it has been dried for, I don't know, this is an object that entered the collection, the museum collections in 1930. So 100 years later, how is algae going to be reacting if it is hit by water? We don't know that. Wood, these are reliquary heads from Gabon. They are from the Fang culture, and they have oozing patinas, which is a mixture of various types of oils that were ointed on the heads of these sculptures so that they could be magically activated. And we don't know. These objects, of course, as you can see, are very heterogeneous in materials, and how they are going to react if they are hit by water is a very, very difficult thing to foresee. And to go from mostly vegetable-based materials to animal-based materials, this is an anorak from the Arctic. It's a little wink to our friends from Quebec. And it is seal gut skin, which is sewn. And it is highly, highly reactive to water. We know that because we've treated and displayed several of these objects. How would they react after a couple of days in water? It's difficult to say. And this is a sculpture from the Vanuatu again, with and you will see this particular piece in display in one of the pictures I will show you later. And this is spider web. So how will spider web react? Whether there's a fire or a flood, I don't know. And so you've made your priority list. You've made your prioritization, and you end up with these, with floor plans of display rooms saying, okay, if there's something to be saved in this room that holds 20 pieces of work, well, these 3 are the ones that need to be evacuated first. And the same thing here is the same thing you see. Now, the problem is these lists you have to endlessly update them for every exhibition, because, for instance, somebody's going to say that this painting by Moreau is going to be lent to, I don't know, Houston in the States. And you have to decide, you think that this particular painting by Tissot is going to enter a temporary exhibition within the museum. So it's not going to go to the other end of the planet, but it's going to go to another room. And so if you have a disaster, you need to make sure that your floor plan has registered that this Tissot is not where it usually is, but that it is in another room, and so on. And same time, every time you change something for display, you need to update these floor plans, which is the reason why that some institutions, and not the least of them, we're talking Rijksmuseum here in Amsterdam, has decided, after the renovation, the director has decided that the prioritization would be only on the paintings by Vermeer, and so there are 4 of them, and the paintings by Rembrandt, and so there are 20 of them. Now, of course, some of them are quite large. For instance, the Night Watch is about 4 meters by 4.5 meters. You want to be ready. It's a good idea to have this as a priority, because you are not going to rescue such a painting without having had a plan, thought of a plan beforehand. But still, it's 24 works of art out of about 1 million artworks in exhibition and storage. So it's a very low level of prioritization. And the reason being that the director and the person who's responsible for the rescue operations, who is a conservator, a paper conservator, have decided that for all other works that might be affected by a disaster, it's the conservation and restoration team that will make decisions based on the specific circumstances of the disaster. And at the Musée du Quai Branly, this is partly what we're running on. It depends on where the artworks are. For instance, here in the storage area, we have again these trolleys, which I showed you, and some containers that have labels that tell us what we should go for first. And what are we going to find? Well, we might find this, which is a shadow picture from China made out of cut leather. This is priority 1. This is another one, priority 2. And this is another one, which is priority 3. The priorities were established by the curators depending on criteria that are their own, which are scientifically based, history-based, history of collections-based, significance-based. But how are we, as conservators, going to be able to decide, if we don't have the help of these boxes and of these labels, what needs to be saved first? And I give you another example, which are no masks from Japanese theater. It's the same. They really look the same. And if they have been prioritized and have different types of housings that we can rely on, well, it's wonderful because it's going to help us. But mostly, as conservators, what we will need to do is we will need to rely on eco-professional guidelines, which I must say, to the best of my knowledge, are the only guidelines for conservation restoration which state something as profound in a way as what you're reading on the screen, which is that as a conservator, during your everyday professional life, you do treatment on the objects that you've been trained on. So if you're a sculpture conservator, you're going to work on specific materials. If you're a book conservator, on specific materials. A paintings conservator, you're going to work on paintings. But in the event of a danger, of a disaster, it is your duty to work panoramically on every possible array of materials and objects or documents types. And for that, what we need to do is we need to prioritize, and we need to label, and we need to rehouse, and we need to think about all these things. But we also need to do exercises on mock objects or on non-heritage objects, which we are going to submit to extreme circumstances so that we can study them as systematically as possible, so that in the event of a disaster, we have the ability to mobilize our knowledge and to act to the best of our knowledge and in the best interest of the cultural heritage. And that's it. That's everything I have to say. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yes, you can stop sharing your screen. Wonderful. Excellent.
I hope it was clear and not too esoteric.
I think it was wonderful, and I can confirm that the comments in the chat box are extremely positive. I think everyone is impressed with the quality of the image material with which you have accompanied your lecture, which makes everything perfectly clear. And because I had the chance of viewing some of the slides before the presentation, I have already told you that I'm really impressed with the photographic material that you have introduced in the presentation, because it really adds another level of information. And fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. And I would just like to remind everyone that if you have any questions for Eléonore, that you can use the chat box to ask these questions. If you are from Croatia, you can pose the question in Croatian, and I will translate it. And so use this opportunity. We still have some 25 minutes left with Eléonore, so let's use the opportunity to ask whatever we want to know. I have to tell you that really the examples were wonderful. It's all very clear. I'm not actually sure that we will have many questions regarding additional explanation of what you said. But what I wanted to ask you to start the discussion, so you mentioned in your presentation that at your museum, it's the curators who set these lists of priority for different kinds of emergency situations. Do you, as a conservative restorer, get invited to the table when these discussions are being led, or not maybe you personally, but any member of conservation restoration department? Do they participate in these discussions? Because conservative restorers have so much knowledge to bring to this discussion. So how does it work at your institution?
Well, when the priorities were established, it had to be done in a very short time span by the curation teams, and I wasn't there at the time, but I'm not aware that the conservation and restoration team was invited at the table. However, it depends where the objects are. Really, for instance, in the permanent exhibition areas, we stick to these priorities that had been established by the curators, and we handle things on an ad hoc basis depending on where and how the disaster strikes. In temporary exhibitions, we work with the service that's in charge of temporary exhibition, and here it's more of a co-constructed choice, and therefore it relies more heavily on material criteria. And in storage, it depends. The priorities are revised very regularly by the curators. And what happens is that the curators talk to us when they revise. They say, oh, we have done this classification for this particular type of objects, let's say, I don't know, African mask from Guinea. And we would like to look into it again, because now we have more time than in 2006, when we had a couple of weeks to do that. I don't know, for instance, for the Department of Africa, many tens of thousands of objects had to be classified very quickly. And therefore, now that we have more time and that we're looking at a group of, let's say, 400 objects, may we exchange views on what would be the pertinent criteria also from a material point of view on this particular corpus. So we are admitted at the table of negotiations quite nicely and without any difficulties. But this, it remains the fact that there has been this global effort to prioritize. It's a big help, and it's a big help in our everyday work, even if we did not partake in that particular decision.
Thank you for that response, Eléonore. In the meantime, we have our first question in the chat box. And this is a question from a colleague, Barbara Horvat-Kavazovic. She's an assistant professor at the Conservation Restoration Department of the Arts Academy in Zagreb. And she has a question which is related to earthquakes, because that is our horrible reality here, the problem that we are now facing very often. So she says the following. Considering our recent crisis in Croatia surrounding earthquakes, have you ever had experience with earthquake-related damage, and what were the issues in those circumstances? So we've seen examples of rescue operations after floods and even fires, but have you had any experiences related to earthquakes?
Thankfully, no, because I don't run after disasters. The further away I am from disasters, the happier I am. No, however, I read on earthquakes as I read on everything else, floods and tsunamis and storms and whatnot. And the characteristics of earthquakes, as described in the professional literature, is the combination of all evils, because you will have usually a very strong and fierce, brutal mechanical impact because the earth moves. But often when you have had an earthquake, you have water mains that burst. And so you can have massive floods in specific buildings. And also often when you have earthquakes, you have electrical fires. So it's really something I would like to stay away from as much as I can. And I think it's highly, highly commendable what you did, Sagita, since when the earthquakes in Zagreb happened, you were in Split. And not only was it an earthquake in March last year, but it was also the lockdown. And so you couldn't go from Split to Zagreb. And you had this wonderful idea of compiling resources, electronic resources, which would be available to your colleagues and that could be available worldwide. And for me, it's always that, which is start with the professional literature that exists, read it thoroughly, read it all, really read it, really like a collector. So there's something maniacal about it. And then, and only then, start messing about with small exercises. And I can't begin to tell you how many floods I've done in my sink, just for the fact of seeing things swell and things distort and then trying to put them back into a proper plane. So earthquake, I have absolutely no experience, thankfully. I'm absolutely sure it must be highly, highly difficult for the people who do intervene after an earthquake. Also for another reason, which is common to all natural disasters or so-called natural disasters, which is that usually they happen at a regional level. So people, yes, they have to deal with the collections that were burnt or flooded or blown away by the storm or broken by the earthquake, but they also have their own home. And they also have their own car, and they also have their own family to worry about. And so any intervention in a situation of regional crisis is really particularly difficult and highly commendable.
Before I move on we have some more questions in the chat box, but I just wanted to ask you, so some of the examples that you have given us in your presentation, they were from other museums, so not from the institution that you work in. Does that mean that you are you part of some kind of national team for emergency response in such events? Or do you simply volunteer to come out and help to some, to go to some other institution that has been affected and provide professional help? How does it work?
I'd like to answer that it's more coordinated than it really is, but it's not. There is a wonderful association which is called the Bouclier Bleu France. And they are the French antenna of the International Blue Shield Committee, and so they have lists of members, and you can be a member regardless whatever your professional activities. So they have conservators, they have registrars, they have librarians, archivists, curators. And that's a great pool of people that can be called upon and that are called upon, but it's through an association, so it's not any state-driven initiative. Then FFCR, the French organization, the French antenna of ECHO, has a list which it has just set up of same thing, volunteers, but that are specifically conservators, restorers. Because for some disasters or post-disaster rescue operations, you need that expertise. It's not always imperative, but in some circumstances, you really do need it. You need that specific approach and that specific discipline and knowledge and competencies. And then there are a few initiatives. There's an initiative of in Normandy, about a regionally driven mutual help network. So there are things like that and they function, but usually what happens is that when a disaster strikes somewhere, people get called And usually the curators from the archives or from the historic house that suffered a disaster will call the professionals that are closest, that are locally available, because it's not the same thing to drive for a half an hour or to take the train for 3 hours. You're not there in the same time, and sometimes there's a question of time contingency. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you have. And we have questions in the chat box, but I see that Olympia has turned on her camera. So if Olympia maybe wants to ask a question in person, she can do so, if I see this correctly.
I am a restorer, but I'm chemist also. I'm very interested on all what is significance or on conservation, on materials. I have a lot of experience, yes. And I was interested on this presentation. The images say all. Was interested. I have not now a lot of time to listen this kind of presentation, and is questions I have not for the moment, because I also read a lot of materials on metal. I was a metal restorer, but also in conservation, all what is important on the cultural heritage, material cultural heritage. I am retired, but I have time, and I want to disseminate this information also in Romanian. I am from Romania, and I try to help my younger colleagues if they are interested also, because this must be a dialogue. I was impressed on this presentation, and I am a curious woman in all what represent the science, the conservation, the restoration, all kind of this that communicate with arts also. And it is not something mechanic. We must use our intellectual capacities also, but we must know foreign language. I read a lot of materials, inclusive this the conservation, general principles, in English, in French language. It is not a problem for me. It's a problem to speak. I have not this a lot of opportunity to use my language, but I understand a lot. That is important also. And it was a very interesting presentation, and the images was great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I am happy that I knew to use this opportunity also.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your very kind comment. And I'm sure that Eleonore is also pleased.
Was a great presentation.
Wonderful.
And it showed that Eléonore worked in this field, have experience. That is important also, not only on documentation, but to have contact with the artifacts, with the materials. That is important also.
Yes, I completely thank you very much for your comment. I completely agree with you that materials are important. Materials are what I deal with as a conservator. It's my paradigm. But there is a question in the chat box by Pierre-Emmanuel Liébor about the decision chain at a time of a disaster. And he asks specifically about the decision chain at the Musée du quai Branly. And I would like to rebound on that because as a conservator, I would have a tendency to focus on materiality and only materiality. But the truth of the matter is that rescue operations function well when logistics function well and when the decision-making chain functions well. And it is a very, very difficult issue. Now at the Musée du Quai Branly, we have something planned on paper, and it has been approved by the general direction of the museum, but it has never been tested. In terms of the chain of operation, we've done it. We've handled disasters before, and the way in which we handled them was that even at 3 o'clock in the morning, one of the conservators from the conservation team, actually physically went in and took care of business, or at least started the rescue operations. But really, the chain of command, should we need to deal with, we've dealt with rather large disasters, but we have never dealt with barely manageable disasters. And to deal with a barely manageable disaster, with a large disaster, for that you need to have a very fluid chain of command. And for that you need to have it on paper, but you need to have tested it, just as you need to test the reaction of your materials in water, or when you elevate the temperature, or when you break it, or when you throw it around. So it's a very good question from Pierre-Emmanuel. I wouldn't like to reduce what I said to only physical, chemical reactions. It has to do with the way in which people take charge. And I might want to add, because there's also a question about small community museums. What is a large disaster? Well, a large disaster is a disaster that you cannot handle with the people that are inside the museum, or the archives, or the library, or the historical site. So it really depends. What might be a small disaster for Musée du Quai Branly might be a massive disaster for a historical house with one person who works there. And so to answer Ariane's question about first advice for small community museums without any person really in charge of the museum or the collections, well, this precisely is when you're going to need to rely on prioritization. You need at some point to have someone, a curator from a museum which is local, even if this person is not in charge specifically of this small community museum, or people from the community, local historians. You need to have somebody decide what's most worthy of salvaging in the event of a disaster, so that people who are going to intervene don't end up spending a massive amount of energy on things that could be replaced like that. So this is my advice, and I know that it's not enough, but it is my advice. And I see there's a last question by Anne Lama from Vancouver about prioritization in an automatic storage, retrieval storage in archives, such as in Harvard or in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, for that matter. And I don't have a clue. I really don't know. I don't know if nothing sits on a permanent shelf, and if things are constantly moved, and if things are retrieved automatically by a machine, which pulls a book off a shelf and puts it in a basket, and it gets driven to the reading room, really the only thing that's left is reacting with your eyes and with the knowledge that you have regarding the reaction of materials once you are physically in the room where the disaster happened. But in that case, prioritization, I don't know how it can be done even. There might be a way to do it, but I don't know.
I think Anne is content with your answer. And Eléonore,
it's good because I don't have another one.
Yes, it's a good topic for further research. So I think that we are now that you have answered all questions that were posted in the chat box. And so I would like to slowly bring our virtual meeting lecture to an end. And at the very end, what I can say that I really want to thank you, Eléonore, on
You're welcome.
my part and also on the part of the entire Croatian Conservation Restoration Association, as well as on the part of everyone in the audience, and it was truly an international audience, for agreeing to deliver this lecture, for taking the time to prepare it, and for spending a part of this evening with us, and for replying to all the questions that were asked. So thank you very much. I'm so happy that through ECHO, we established this professional contact. That's the importance of international networking, and so we are really happy that you have joined this series of online lectures. And before I close the meeting, I would like to invite my colleague Andrea Dragojevic. She is a member of the Croatian Conservation Restoration Association, and she is the head conservator restorer at the Croatian State Archives. And I would like to ask Andrea to give a short announcement of the next lecture in our series. The lecture will be in Croatian. So Andrea, you can announce it either in English or in Croatian, whatever you prefer. So go ahead.
At first, I would like to thank Eléonore. It's very interesting. I'm paper conservator too. And I know the problems of flood and all of that, catastrophes. And we don't have anything right on black and white, what we can do, what we will do if some disaster will happen. So I know the problems, but that's reality.
You have to start one day.
Yes, I'm just 6
time.
years in Croatian State Archives, so I think I need lots of conservation, lots of talking with the archivists, because I think they don't understand the problem. But it's maybe for another time talking. Yes, I would like to announce a lecture of my colleague. He is a conservator, because he's not a conservator restored, he's just a conservator, Želimir Laslo. And I just have a theme of his lecture, not the title. It's rescuing cultural heritage objects during our how do you say, Domovinski rat, during our war, Croatian War. Yeah, Croatian War, and it will be 10 of the March, 10 of the March, in same time. And he has lots of experience in that field. Now he is retired, but I asked him to share his experience with us, just to see in real situation how they solve the problem and how they react, because lots of conservators during the Croatian War deal with that problem now, and during the earthquake in Petrinja and Sisak. And it's very good to see that experience. So that's it.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. So it will be a very important topic. As Andrea mentioned, the consequences of the earthquake in Petrinja and Sisak, they have been compared to the consequences of war destruction, like the scope of damage to historical objects like churches or other buildings. It can be compared to war. So Andrea proposed that as a part of this series, we invite this colleague who has this experience from 1990s and the Croatian War of Independence, and to share this story to younger colleagues, because we feel that it's immensely important that these knowledge and practical experiences and things that people have learned by doing, that they are shared and that they are passed on, because that's what empowers us now today to respond to emergency situations. So thank you very much, Andrea. Andrea is the organizer of that event. And thank you again to Eléonore for delivering this talk. I truly hope that we will see you again in Croatia in the near future. And thank you to everyone who has joined us. It was really a pleasure. So you will be able to access the recording of today's event on the YouTube channel of the Croatian Conservation Restoration Association. So thank you everyone and have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.